High above the massive warship, Admiral Vorthak watched from a sleek observation room, his eyes fixed on the human child, sitting before a glowing Starship simulator. The child appeared small and insignificant compared to the vastness of the starry battlefield displayed before them, but there was something captivating in the way the child's fingers moved with practiced precision over the controls, a subtle yet undeniable sense of purpose in each gesture. Vorthak was no stranger to simulations. He had seen countless species using such systems to hone their skills, but this was different. The child's movements were more than just simple inputting of commands. They were deliberate, fluid, almost instinctual. The simulation was designed for training military minds to prepare commanders for the challenges of warfare in the vastness of space. It was a tool used by thousands of species to perfect their tactical and strategic abilities. Yet the Admiral found himself watching closely as the child navigated a digital starship with an ease that left him curious. The child was navigating through an asteroid field, dodging deadly debris, while fending off enemy fighters. The child was skilled, but Vorthak noticed something unusual about the way the child operated the vessel. There was no hesitation, no moment of doubt in the decisions the child made. It was as if they knew exactly what would happen before it did. Vorthak leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing in concentration. The simulator was supposed to react in predictable patterns. The digital enemies were pre-programmed to follow certain tactics based on established algorithms. Yet this child appeared to be reading the simulation as if it were a living thing, adapting and responding to every move with an unnatural awareness. The Admiral had spent decades studying warfare and tactics across the galaxy. He had seen brilliant military minds at work. But this child was doing something that didn't fit into any of the known strategies he had come across before. For a moment, Vorthak allowed himself to consider the possibility that there might be more to this than just a simple game. Was the child somehow learning faster than any other species he had encountered? Could it be that humans were capable of adapting to warfare in ways no one could predict? He watched in fascination as the child expertly avoided an incoming barrage of enemy fire. With a swift and seemingly random maneuver, the child's hands danced over the console with a fluidity that suggested years of experience. Yet Vorthak knew this child was not old enough to have served in any military. The Admiral had studied human psychology and warfare tactics before, and he knew that the human mind was capable of great things. But this felt different. This felt like something more. The simulation continued to unfold before him, with the child deftly commanding the digital starship through complex maneuvers that even Vorthak would have hesitated to attempt in real battle. His thoughts raced as he considered the implications of what he was witnessing. Could this child represent a new generation of human commanders, each capable of such mastery? Or was it simply an anomaly in the data? Was this something that was uniquely human, something that could one day prove to be a powerful force on the galactic stage? As the child engaged yet another enemy ship with surprising efficiency, the Admiral felt a strange sense of unease building inside him. The human child was more than just a player in a simulator. This was a glimpse into something much larger, a force the likes of which the Zorkar Empire had never encountered. Admiral Vorthak leaned back into his chair, his sharp eyes still fixed on the screen before him. The human child's actions were becoming more and more unsettling. He had expected to see the usual patterns of an inexperienced player, clumsy attempts at managing a complex system. But instead, he saw something far more refined. The child wasn't just playing a game, they were thinking, as if the very nature of the simulation had been ingrained into their mind, and that thought sent a ripple of concern through the Admiral's calm exterior. For centuries, Vorthak had led his fleet through countless campaigns. His people, the Zorkar, had built an empire spanning multiple galaxies. Their military supremacy was unrivaled. Their ships were a fusion of devastating firepower and advanced technologies, and their tactics were honed by generations of warriors. But now, as he watched this human child on the simulator, he began to wonder if they were prepared for what might come next. The Zorkar were a species of logic and calculation. Their warfare was methodical and precise. They depended on overwhelming strength and superior numbers to secure victory. Every battle followed predictable patterns dictated by centuries of experience. But the humans had a different approach. They fought with an unpredictable creativity that defied logic and tradition. Vorthak had read the reports of human battles firsthand, and each one told the same story. Humans didn't play by the same rules. They bent and twisted strategies in ways the Zorkar couldn't easily foresee. He thought back to the recent conflict at the edge of Zorkar space. The human fleet had been outgunned and outclassed in terms of firepower, but the humans didn't retreat or surrender. They fought with an intensity and innovation that confounded the Admiral's commanders. They took advantage of every loophole, every opportunity, and in the end, the humans had inflicted far more damage than expected. The Admiral had underestimated them. Then, but now, as he observed this child, he could see it was not a fluke. This was not some random stroke of luck. The simulation on the screen shifted once again. The child had navigated their ship into the midst of an enemy fleet that seemed to outnumber them 5-1. The virtual enemies closed in from all directions, but the child did not hesitate. Instead, they adjusted their course at the last possible second, moving through the fleet with a grace that left Vorthak in awe. The child's fingers tapped the controls quickly but with purpose. Each movement was measured, each choice executed with military precision. The ship dodged incoming fire by mere inches and returned fire with calculated accuracy. Vorthak's mind raced as the child continued to weave through the digital battlefield in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The child's tactics were not about brute force. They were about movement, about positioning and speed. It was as if the child understood something that others could not see, a hidden logic that tied everything together beyond the limits of the simulation's code. The Admiral's instincts told him that this was no simple game. The child was executing real-time strategy with the same level of foresight that Vorthak himself would use in an actual battle. He had to admit it. The humans were more than he had given them credit for. Their minds were a weapon in their own right, and they weren't limited to the physical power of their warships. Their greatest strength lay in their creativity, their ability to adapt on the fly, to see patterns where others saw chaos, and Vorthak could not help but wonder just how far this potential reached. How many more like this child were out there waiting to rise to the occasion? And if this was only the beginning of humanity's military evolution, what would the galaxy look like in another few decades? The simulation intensified with each passing second. The child's ship weaving through space like a living organism, responding to its captain's every command with precision. Vorthak's eyes never left the screen, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was witnessing. This wasn't just a child playing a game. This was something else entirely. The way the ship moved, how it avoided enemy fire with calculated reflexes, how it attacked. There was no hesitation, no error in judgment. Every movement seemed to carry purpose, as if the child already knew how the battle would unfold before it did. The enemy fleet closed in, a swarm of fighters, their guns blazing, surrounding the child's ship on all sides. Yet with an almost casual flick of her wrist, the child initiated a series of maneuvers that took the digital ship into the heart of the enemy formation. Vorthak blinked, certain he had missed something. There was no way this was simply instinct. It felt deliberate, like the child had foreseen the movements of the enemy ships. The child wasn't just avoiding damage. They were positioning themselves, luring the enemy into a trap. The virtual environment reacted with an unnatural responsiveness, as if it too recognized the skill behind the pilot's moves. As the simulation continued, Vorthak's growing unease took root. The enemy ships, once a deadly threat, now seemed to be following a script. They attacked, but it was as if they were waiting for the child's next move. Each digital enemy fighter was dodging, then attacking in predictable patterns, leaving gaps, leaving openings for the child to exploit. It was as if the simulation itself had become attuned to the child's strategy, anticipating her every move with startling accuracy. This was not the usual behavior of the simulator. Vorthak had seen countless simulations in his time, and the rules were always the same. The systems would simulate combat scenarios with varying degrees of difficulty, but the enemies always followed fixed parameters. They couldn't change, couldn't learn. Yet here, the simulation was adapting in ways he couldn't explain. The child's actions were influencing the digital environment in real time. It was almost as if the simulation had become sentient, responding not just to the input of the child, but to her strategic brilliance. The child's ship dove into a group of enemy fighters, moving through them with an agility that defied logic. In the span of seconds, 3 of the virtual ships exploded in clouds of fire, their pilots caught by surprise. The rest of the fleet seemed to falter for a moment, as if stunned by the sudden turn of events. Vorthek leaned in closer, his mind working furiously to keep up. What was happening here? How could this be happening? Then it hit him. The child wasn't just playing a game. They were hacking the system. No, not hacking. She was making the simulation bend to her will, manipulating the parameters in real time to create the battlefield she needed. The simulation's artificial intelligence, designed to mimic real combat scenarios, was struggling to keep pace with the child's uncanny understanding of strategy. The child was creating openings that the simulation had not anticipated, pushing it beyond its original design. For a moment, Vorthek felt a surge of awe, followed quickly by a sense of dread. If a child, an untrained, untested human, could master the simulation like this, what did it mean for the future of his empire? The Zorkar had always relied on overwhelming force, on technological superiority. But this was something new, something that no amount of firepower or tactical training could counter. As the child's ship delivered the final blow to the last enemy fighter, Vorthek sat back in his chair stunned. The simulation ended, but the Admiral's thoughts did not. The child turned away from the console, oblivious to the impact of what had just occurred. Vorthek, however, was not so easily dismissive. This was no ordinary game. What had just happened was a glimpse into the future, one where humanity could bend any system, even the most advanced, to their will. And that thought left the Admiral deeply unsettled. As the simulation concluded, the child leaned back in the chair, a small smile of satisfaction playing on their lips. It was an innocent expression, one of accomplishment and perhaps a touch of pride, but to Admiral Vorthek, it felt like something far more dangerous. The child had just defeated an entire fleet in the blink of an eye, something that even the most seasoned warriors would struggle to achieve. And yet this was only a game, a simple training tool that millions of species used for preparation. Or at least, it had been a simple tool. Vorthek's mind raced as he processed what he had just witnessed. He had seen military genius before, many times, in fact. The Zorkar Empire had conquered countless worlds, fought in countless battles, and emerged victorious through sheer dominance. Their military was built on centuries of meticulous strategy, advanced technology, and an unyielding sense of superiority. And yet, he had never seen anything quite like this. The human child, for all their apparent innocence, had displayed an uncanny ability to adapt, to predict, and to manipulate the very environment they were in. This was no simple display of skill. This was instinct, a primal, unspoken understanding of how to survive, how to win, that transcended training and intellect. The child had not just played the simulation, they had mastered it, bending it to their will in a way that defied the Admiral's understanding. Vorthek's thoughts drifted back to the early days of the conflict between the Zorkar and humanity. The humans had been an unexpected adversary, their ships primitive compared to the advanced technology of the Zorkar, yet they had fought with a tenacity that had shocked the Admiral. Where other species might have crumbled in the face of overwhelming force, humanity had shown a surprising resilience. They fought not just with their weapons, but with their minds. They adapted quickly, learning from every encounter, adjusting their tactics in real time in ways that seemed impossible. But watching this child, Vorthek began to understand that it was more than just resilience. It was something deeper, something core to the human experience. Humans were not just survivors. They were innovators. They saw challenges as opportunities, obstacles as puzzles to be solved. And most terrifying of all, they did not fear failure. They learned from it, improved from it, and came back stronger each time. The Admiral's mind flicked through the countless military engagements the Zorkar had fought over the millennia, and a troubling realization began to take root. The Zorkar had always relied on the certainty of their power. Their warships were unrivaled in firepower, their tactics tried and true, and their soldiers trained from birth to be the finest warriors in the galaxy. But against humanity, against the human will, it seemed that nothing was guaranteed. Where the Zorkar depended on the logic of their strategies, humans fought with a kind of chaotic brilliance, unpredictable, instinctive, and ever-evolving. Vorthek's gaze turned back to the child, who was now stretching their arms, clearly unaware of the deeper implications of their actions. The Admiral's chest tightened. What had just happened was not simply a child beating a game. This was a message, a warning. The child's capacity to adapt, to learn, to bend the simulation to their will was a sign of what was to come. If humanity could unlock this potential in their youth, what would they be capable of when they came of age? For a brief moment, Vorthek felt the weight of that question pressing down on him. The Zorkar had conquered the galaxy through power and precision, but humanity's strength lay in something altogether different, and that, Vorthek realized, was far more dangerous. The Admiral leaned forward, his hands steepled in thought. He had seen the future, and it was human. Admiral Vorthek stood in the observation room long after the simulation had ended, his gaze still fixed on the child who now sat idly by the console, her fingers idly tracing the edges of the controls as if nothing of consequence had just transpired. To anyone else, it would have appeared to be just another routine training session, but Vorthek was no fool. The display he had just witnessed was no accident, no fluke, it was a declaration. And the child's seemingly casual demeanor only deepened the sense of unease slowly coiling in his chest. He thought back to the early days of humanity's involvement in the conflict between their species. At first, the Zorkar had underestimated them, assuming they were just another species of primitives, capable of little more than basic survival. It had been easy to dismiss their early attempts at resistance as nothing more than desperate acts of a weaker race fighting above their weight class. But now, as the Admiral's mind traced back to those early encounters, he realized the mistake he had made. The humans were not desperate. They were determined and far more capable than anyone had given them credit for. The Zorkar had always prided themselves on their superior intellect, their strategic superiority, and their unrivaled technological advancements. Every military maneuver, every battle, had been planned and executed with cold precision, guided by centuries of experience. They had faced formidable opponents in the past, but none had ever shown the adaptability, the resourcefulness that humanity had displayed time and again. And now, with this child's uncanny performance in the simulator, it was clear that the problem was not just their ability to fight back. It was their ability to think and adapt in ways no one had anticipated. Vorthek's mind flickered back to the encounter with the human fleet at the border of Zorkar space. At first, the battle had seemed like just another routine skirmish, a chance to demonstrate Zorkar's superiority. But what had transpired had shaken the Admiral to his core. The humans fought with a strange unpredictability, an unwillingness to follow any script. Their ships did not engage in the predictable formations that the Zorkar were accustomed to seeing. Their tactics were fluid, ever-shifting, and when faced with overwhelming odds, they didn't break. They adapted. At one point during the skirmish, a small human vessel had made a suicide run, charging directly into the heart of the Zorkar fleet. It should have been easily destroyed. But as the human ship neared the heart of the enemy lines, it pulled off a maneuver so unexpected, so audacious, that the Zorkar fleet had no time to react. The human vessel slipped past the front lines, causing chaos within the enemy ranks, and in the confusion, it inflicted severe damage to two capital ships. The Zorkar had fought through that battle, but the damage had been done, both to their ships and to their pride. Now, standing in the observation room, Vorthek realized that the human child in front of him was merely a microcosm of the larger threat. The Zorkar had underestimated the true power of humanity's resolve, and this child was just the latest example of their relentless innovation and strategic ingenuity. The simulator had been built to test the limits of a mind, but it was clear that the child had done more than just master it. She had bent it to her will, making the digital world respond to her in ways that should not have been possible. The realization struck Vorthak like a lightning bolt. If this child, with no formal training, could manipulate a digital war simulation with such expertise, what would happen when humanity's brightest minds came together, when they had the resources and the experience to truly understand the art of war? What would happen when their sheer willpower was focused on the real galaxy instead of a game? It was a chilling thought, and one that Vorthak couldn't shake. This wasn't just a game. Humanity wasn't playing. They were learning. They were evolving. And the Zorkar Empire had no plan for that. Admiral Vorthak's mind churned as he stood in the observation room, the hum of the Starship's engines in the background offering no comfort. His eyes remained fixed on the child, whom now sat quietly, seemingly unaware of the storm raging in the Admiral's mind. Vorthak knew that what he had just witnessed wasn't a random outburst of brilliance, but rather a glimpse into the very nature of humanity itself. The child, with her natural aptitude for strategy and instinctive understanding of warfare, was a perfect example of what humanity was capable of when pressed to its limits. The child's performance in the simulator had illuminated something that Vorthak hadn't fully appreciated before. The true strength of the human species didn't lie in their weapons or their technology, but in their minds. The Zorkar had always prided themselves on their technological superiority, their ability to create machines of war that were unmatched in power and precision. Their weapons were designed to destroy, their tactics built to crush all who opposed them. But humanity, it seemed, fought with something else entirely. They fought with ingenuity, with adaptability, and most terrifying of all, with an unrelenting will to succeed, to survive, no matter the odds. Vorthak had seen many species over the years, each with their strengths and weaknesses, but humans were different. They didn't rely on sheer power or unbreakable tactics. They relied on their ability to adapt. The more Vorthak thought about it, the more he realized that this adaptability was humanity's greatest weapon. Where other species had rigid strategies, humanity thrived in uncertainty, their minds able to rapidly reframe situations and respond to new threats. It wasn't simply a matter of surviving. They had the uncanny ability to learn, to grow, and to turn their perceived weaknesses into strengths. It was a quality that the Zorkar had never truly encountered before. For all their might, the Zorkar were predictable. Their methods were honed through centuries of tradition, and they had always relied on their overwhelming superiority to dominate other species. But humanity didn't operate within the confines of predictability. Where the Zorkar had rigid lines of strategy, humanity's lines were constantly shifting, constantly evolving. This was the part that unnerved Vorthak the most. The humans weren't just unpredictable in battle. They were unpredictable in their very approach to existence. They didn't approach challenges with brute force. They approached them with a combination of creativity, resilience, and sheer determination. It was an organic force, one that couldn't be easily categorized, let alone controlled. Humanity could take the simplest of tools and transform them into something extraordinary, something deadly. The simulator was only the latest example of this ingenuity, a tool meant to test military minds, and yet the child had bent it to her will. What would they do when their creativity was applied to real war? What could stop them when their entire species was driven by this unstoppable will? Vorthak's thoughts flashed back to the first major engagement with the human fleet, a battle that should have been a simple victory for the Zorkar. Instead, it had become a confusing nightmare. The humans had refused to fight by the Zorkar's rules. They had shown no fear, no hesitation in the face of overwhelming odds. They fought with a kind of relentless ingenuity that left the Admiral's forces in disarray. It was that very unpredictability that had allowed them to gain ground, that had made the conflict last far longer than it should have. The humans had an ability to surprise, to outthink and outmaneuver even the most experienced of warriors. And that, Vorthek realized, was something the Zorkar couldn't replicate. The Admiral's gaze shifted back to the child, whose eyes were now focused on the console, a quiet concentration on her face. There was no arrogance, no pride in her demeanor, just the calm certainty of someone who had mastered something that others couldn't even begin to understand. And suddenly, the future of the galaxy seemed far less certain to Vorthek than it had ever been before. Vorthek's thoughts were consumed by the realization that had been slowly dawning on him throughout the observation. Humanity was not simply a challenge to be defeated. They were a force to be reckoned with, one that would not be easily understood or defeated through conventional methods. As the child continued to sit before the simulator, Vorthek was no longer concerned merely with the tactics she had displayed. His mind was racing through the broader implications. What he had just witnessed was not just the actions of a gifted individual, it was a harbinger of the future. The child was a reflection of humanity as a whole, resourceful, persistent, and unafraid of challenges. Their minds worked in ways that defied the Zorkar's rigid sense of strategy. If even one human, untrained in the arts of war, could bend a military simulation to her will, what did it say about humanity as a whole? What were they capable of when their full potential was realized and harnessed? The Zorkar had always valued predictability, knowing the outcome of every engagement before it began. Their strategies were a complex web of calculated moves, designed to overpower and dominate. But humans operated in a different realm entirely. They thrived in uncertainty, adapted to chaos, and most disconcertingly, they learned. They learned quickly, adjusting to the unexpected and overcoming obstacles in ways that were unpredictable. What Vorthek had seen was the seed of a much larger potential, one that could not be simply contained or outmatched. He recalled the reports of other recent human engagements. In one instance, a human fleet had been cornered by a far superior enemy, with no clear means of escape. But instead of surrendering, they had employed a tactic so daring, so unforeseen, that it left the enemy exposed to a counterattack. The human fleet had taken risks where any other would have hesitated, pushing the limits of what was considered rational, and emerged victorious. It wasn't just a matter of chance, it was a testament to the human spirit. Their willingness to do the unexpected, to turn adversity into opportunity, made them far more dangerous than any fleet or weapon could ever be. Vorthek took a slow, measured breath. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that this was not a challenge that could be solved with brute force alone. The Zorkar's greatest strength had always been their superiority in battle, their invincible war machines, and their precision. But none of these advantages would matter against an opponent that was inherently unpredictable, who could turn any situation, no matter how desperate, into an advantage. What would happen when humanity's creativity was unleashed across a battlefield, given the proper training and experience? How could the Zorkar, or any empire for that matter, counter such a force? The question gnawed at him. The galaxy had always been a place where power had defined the victor, where the strongest had always triumphed. But now, the rules were changing, and the Zorkar Empire was caught in the middle of it. This new type of warfare, this human style of warfare, was a force that no one could control or predict, and that uncertainty made it more dangerous than anything Vorthek had encountered before. He turned his eyes back to the child, who had now started a new simulation, her movements focused and methodical. Despite the awe that still gripped him, a surge of deep concern mixed with it. The Zorkar were not prepared for what was coming. Even their vast resources, their immeasurable military power, might not be enough to hold back the flood of innovation and willpower that humanity was capable of. The galaxy was moving toward an unknown future, one that Vorthek had not anticipated, and one that now made him question everything he had believed about power, war, and dominance. Humanity's path was uncharted, and in that unknown territory, Vorthak saw the shadow of something far more dangerous than he had ever realized. As the simulation continued, Vorthak felt the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. His once unshakable confidence in the superiority of the Zorkar Empire had begun to crack. The Zorkar had always seen themselves as the ultimate force in the galaxy, their tactics flawless, their technology unmatched. They had never needed to question their position of dominance. But now, in the face of humanity's relentless adaptability, Vorthak realized just how fragile that dominance truly was. The child continued to pilot the simulator with an ease that only deepened his unease. There was something fundamentally different about her, about humans in general, that Vorthak couldn't shake. While his species was a product of logic and precision, humanity seemed to be driven by something else. A raw, instinctual drive to survive and innovate, no matter the odds. It was as though every human, from the youngest to the oldest, carried within them the seed of brilliance, waiting to be unlocked when the time was right. This was not a quality that could be easily defeated or crushed. It was, in its essence, a force that only grew stronger in the face of adversity. Vorthak's mind raced through the possible futures. Could the Zorkar outmaneuver humanity? Could they anticipate their next move? It seemed unlikely. Humanity didn't follow a fixed pattern. They didn't act in ways that could be predicted or controlled. They adapted, they improvised, and they learned, often faster than any empire could comprehend. What had once seemed like an unlikely threat was now a full-blown reality. The Admiral turned his attention back to the child. There was no fanfare or acknowledgement of the brilliance she had just displayed. To her, this was just another simulation, just another game. But for Vorthak, it was the beginning of something much larger. It was the beginning of humanity's ascension into a power that could challenge any empire in the galaxy. He thought about the broader implications for the galaxy itself. The Zorkar had relied on their strength and technology to subdue weaker species, but they had never encountered anything like this. Humanity, with their creativity and adaptability, would not be so easily subdued. They would fight not just with weapons and ships, but with their very minds. And that, Vorthak realized, was far more dangerous than any weapon could ever be. The child stood up from the console, stretching her arms, oblivious to the fact that she had just sparked a storm in the mind of one of the galaxy's most powerful military leaders. Vorthak found himself struck by the sheer simplicity of the moment. Here was a child, playing a game, yet in that game, she had displayed the raw, unbridled potential of an entire species. Humanity was no longer a curious oddity or a fledgling threat. They were a force in the galaxy, one whose rise could not be ignored or stopped. For a long moment, Vorthak simply watched her, feeling the weight of the realization sink in. The future was not as it had once seemed. It was shifting, and the stars were no longer aligned in the way he had once believed. The human race was on an uncharted path, one that no one could predict, but one that would inevitably change the face of the galaxy forever. With a final glance at the child, Vorthak turned away from the observation window. The galaxy was on the precipice of a new era, and humanity, against all odds, was at its heart. What that meant for the Zorkar, and for the rest of the universe, remained to be seen. But one thing was certain: the game had changed, and humanity was no longer just playing.